In October of 1983, the smell reached Vernon Caudill before the site did. He had stepped off the farmhouse porch at 5:30 in the morning, the way he had done since he was 23 years old, and the air carried something wrong, a flat mineral bitterness. Nothing like the wood smoke and frost-killed clover that belonged to Pike County, Kentucky at that hour. He stood at the edge of the yard, 64 years old, wearing the same canvas work coat he had worn for a decade, and listened. The creek at the lower edge of the property ran its usual sound, but underneath it there was a dull, granular silence where the bottomland should have rustled with drying corn stalks. Vernon walked the quarter-mile to the south field before the sun cleared Elkhorn Ridge, and what he found stopped him at the fence line. The coal fines, the fine black dust residue from the Randall Extraction Company's preparation plant 3/4 of a mile upwind, had settled across his 12 acres of bottomland in a layer that ran between 1 and 3 inches deep, depending on where the draws in the land had collected the drift. The best soil on his property, 40 years of composting and careful rotation, all of it buried under black grit. He owed $34,000 to the Federal Land Bank of Louisville on this farm. The bottomland was its collateral. Those 12 acres had produced the sweet corn and tomatoes and pole beans that covered every mortgage payment he had made since 1967. Without them, the math stopped working. He pulled a handful of the coal dust and held it in his palm. His hand stayed open for a long time. The Randall Extraction Company operated the preparation plant on Cane Creek Road under a permit issued by the Kentucky Department for Natural Resources in 1979. The permit allowed for coal fines disposal in a lined impoundment on the company's own property. What it did not allow was atmospheric discharge across neighboring land, but the language described this prohibition in terms of best available technology and commercially reasonable practices, which in 1983 in Pike County required an attorney to unwrap and a judge to enforce. Vernon contacted Harris and Muncie, the law firm in Pikeville that handled mineral rights disputes. The senior partner, Dale Muncie, reviewed the permit in a single afternoon and told Vernon what it would cost to pursue the matter: a retainer of $4,000, litigation that could run 18 months, and an outcome that depended on whether Kentucky courts were willing to define atmospheric coal fines displacement as a violation of the permit's intent rather than its letter. Vernon did not have $4,000 liquid. He drove to the Randall Extraction Company office the following Thursday. The plant superintendent, Gary Holt, received him in a conference room that smelled of copy machine toner and burnt coffee. Holt was 41, well-dressed, and genuinely unhurried. He had handled property complaints before. He listened to Vernon for approximately 3 minutes, then placed a document on the table, a study conducted by the company's environmental consultant, which concluded that coal fines at the volumes present on Vernon's property posed no demonstrable long-term soil productivity impact. Holt said, "Mr. Caudill, coal dust is carbon. Carbon is what your soil already runs on." He said this in front of his secretary, who was taking notes. Vernon said, "You're telling me the problem is a solution." Holt said, "I'm telling you what the science says." The document cited 3 studies, all published between 1979 and 1982, all funded by mining industry foundations. The conclusion in each was the same. Coal finds in agricultural soil caused no measurable harm. What none of the studies addressed was what happened when 40 to 60 tons of coal dust settled on 12 acres of productive bottomland in a single season, burying the existing topsoil structure, compacting the drainage channels, and altering the pH balance in ways that would take years to appear in a crop yield. Vernon's neighbors at the coffee counter of Hatfield's feed supply on Route 119 told him to take a settlement if Randall offered one. "You'll spend more fighting it than it's worth," said the man who farmed the ridge parcel above Vernon's east line. 2 others at the counter nodded. Vernon paid for his coffee and left. Vernon had his father's notebooks. There were 11 of them, composition style, filled with Samuel Caudill's small, precise handwriting. A man who had farmed the same bottomland from 1919 until his death in 1961, and who had, in the winter of 1931, spent 3 months corresponding by postal mail with an agricultural extension agent in Morgantown, West Virginia, named Samuel Tharp. Tharp had been experimenting between 1928 and 1934 with what he called stratified carbon amendment, a technique for rehabilitating the heavy clay hardpan soils common to the Appalachian coalfields by introducing coal fines at precisely controlled depths within the soil profile. Tharp's hypothesis was specific. Coal fines, placed between 6 and 14 inches below the surface, could function as a slow-release carbon sponge, improving moisture retention in the lower root zone while the layers above were managed with organic matter. He was not talking about spreading coal dust on topsoil. He was talking about burying it at a precise depth, in a precise ratio within a 7-layer profile of other amendments. At the surface, coal fines compacted and smothered. At depth they stored. Tharp had never published this work. He had distributed carbon-copied notes to 12 farmers in the West Virginia Extension Network between 1933 and 1936, and when Depression-era budget cuts erased small-scale research funding, the project ended without formal record. The notes survived because Samuel Tharp had kept every letter and transcribed Tharp's formulas into Notebook 7, cross-referenced with his own soil observations from the Pike County bottomland. Vernon had read those notebooks as a young man and set them aside. The soil had been good. There had been no reason to revisit the technique. He read Notebook 7 again in November of 1983, at the kitchen table, under the overhead light, with a legal pad beside him. Tharp's formula called for 7 distinct layers, each serving a specific function in the soil profile. The depth ratios were exact. The materials were ordinary straw, aged manure, creek sand, native topsoil, combined with coal fines in a sequence Tharp had derived from 3 years of field observation in Marion County, West Virginia. Vernon looked at the formula. Then he looked out the window toward the south field. He went to the barn. The 1954 Farmall Super M had belonged to his father. It was red, like all Farmalls, faded to the particular orange red of old enamel that has been repainted once and left to weather for another decade. The rear tires had been replaced in 1971. The hydraulic system had been rebuilt in 1978. Vernon maintained it according to a handwritten service schedule on a clipboard hanging from a nail inside the barn door. Oil changes, valve clearances, fuel filter intervals, all recorded in the same composition notebooks his father had used for everything else. The tractor ran without argument. He began in November of 1983. The first step was counterintuitive. Rather than trying to remove the coal fines from the surface, an impossible task without equipment he didn't own and money he didn't have, Vernon used a borrowed single-bottom plow to turn the contaminated layer down to 10 inches. This buried the surface coal fines and brought the underlying clay hardpan up. He now had the raw materials positioned at depth. The coal fines were where Tharp needed them. The work ahead was to build the profile above. He spread 6 inches of aged cattle manure, sourced from his own herd of 12 Angus cows, across the turned surface, and disked it in with the farmall. Then came a 2-inch layer of creek sand pulled from the gravel bar at the lower property edge with a borrowed dump trailer. Then a layer of wheat straw, dry and still from the previous summer's cutting. Then native topsoil scraped from the higher ground at the west edge of the field, where the profile had never been contaminated. Then another straw layer. Then a final dressing of composted manure and wood ash from the farm's heating stove, mixed at the ratio notebook 7 specified as 2:1, ash to finished compost by volume. 7 layers total. The coal fines sat as the third layer from the bottom, serving as Tharp had described, a moisture buffer and slow carbon reservoir in the lower root zone. The surface profile was clean, biologically active and draining. The pH at the surface measured 6.4 with the lime Vernon added to correct the alkalinity the coal dust had introduced to the topsoil horizon. He did this across all 12 acres, alone. It took until the third week of January 1984. In February, Roy Bentley, who farmed the ridge ground to the north and had known Vernon for 30 years, stopped his truck on Route 119 and asked what he was doing to the south field. Vernon told him he was amending the soil. Roy looked at the dark, layered surface visible through the snow patches and said, "Looks like you're just moving the mess around." Vernon said, "Yes." That was the whole conversation. The seed order arrived in March of 1984. $40 in mortgage lifter tomato seed, the heritage variety bred in Logan, West Virginia in the 1930s by M.C. Biles, a radiator repairman who had grown them large enough to sell at $1 a packet until his own mortgage was cleared. The variety required a long season, a deep root zone, and soil that held moisture without drowning the lower roots, which was precisely the condition Tharp's 7-layer system was designed to produce. Vernon had grown mortgage lifters since 1966 and understood what they needed better than he understood most things. He transplanted 1,400 seedlings into the south field on May 12, 1984, after the last frost date for Pike County had passed. Spacing ran 30 inches between plants, 4 feet between rows. At that density, the root systems of mature plants would reach the coal fines layer by midsummer, never surfacing in it, only drawing moisture and carbon up through the clean profile built above. In late June, Clyde Maynard stopped at the fence line on his way back from the co-op. Clyde was 68, had farmed Pike County since 1943, and delivered opinions about soil without invitation. He looked at Vernon's tomato plants for a long moment. Even at 6 weeks of growth, they were visibly different from what contaminated bottomland should produce. The stems were thick, the canopy spread evenly. There was no chlorosis in the leaf color. Clyde said, "How'd you get that color?" Vernon said, "Amended it." Clyde said, "On coal ground." Vernon picked up the end of his irrigation line and walked further into the field. Clyde drove to the co-op and told 3 people the same story: that Vernon Caudill was farming the Randall coal ground, and that something worth watching might be happening. None of the 3 believed it would amount to anything. In July, Vernon noticed that the root suckers on the mortgage lifter plants were producing a secondary set of fruit clusters he had not seen in 18 years of growing the variety. He marked 6 plants with surveyor's tape and recorded the observation in a new notebook without further comment. The dry spell arrived in the 3rd week of July, the driest stretch Pike County had recorded since 1953, according to the courthouse weather logs. The creek at the lower field edge dropped to a trickle, running over bare gravel in a sound that was more hiss than flow. Vernon's gravity-fed irrigation system, built from 2-inch galvanized pipe laid in 1969, could not draw enough volume to cover the full 12 acres. He prioritized the center 4 acres where the tomatoes were densest, and left the outer perimeter unirrigated for 17 consecutive days. He expected to lose the perimeter plants. He did not. The outer-ring tomatoes stressed visibly, leaves curled inward during midday heat, conserving moisture. The undersides showing pale green in the way a tomato leaf does when it is working harder than it wants to. But the root systems had reached the coal fines layer by that point in the season, and the coal fines retained moisture at depth long after the surface soil had dried to powder. The plants drew from a reservoir with no connection to the failing creek. When the August rains returned, the perimeter plants recovered undamaged and set their heaviest fruit load in the final 6 weeks of the season. Vernon sat on the fender of the farmall at the edge of the field that afternoon, the metal warm through his work pants from sitting in the sun all day, and looked at the outering plants for a long time. He opened the notebook. He wrote 2 words: Tharp right. During this same period, Dale Munsey at Harris and Munsey had filed a formal complaint with the Kentucky Department for Natural Resources on Vernon's behalf, documenting the coal fines displacement through surveyor measurements, soil core samples, and wind data obtained from the National Weather Service station at Pikeville. The retainer had been waived. Munsey had agreed to a contingency arrangement after reviewing the permit language more carefully and identifying a specific clause prohibiting fugitive dust emissions, extending beyond the facility boundary. The case moved through administrative channels at the pace that administrative channels move, but it moved. The harvest began on August 28, 1984. Vernon picked the first mortgage lifters before 7 in the morning, when the light was still angled and cool across the field, turning the red fruit to deep amber at the shoulders. The air in the rows smelled of tomato leaf and damp soil, and the faint iron smell of dew on the galvanized irrigation pipe. He used a wooden crate he had built from pallet lumber in 1971, 30 inches by 18, carried by a knotted rope handle. He crouched to check each stem attachment and pressed lightly at the blossom end to test for give. The fruit was large. Not exceptional in individual specimen terms, but uniformly large across all 12 acres. An average individual weight of 1 pound, 3 ounces, calculated from a sample of 40 fruit taken at random across 6 different rows. The skin was unblemished. When he cut one open with his pocket knife on the truck tailgate, the flesh was dense to the core. No water ring, no hollow seed cavities. The color ran deep, red all the way through, the way an old variety does when it has found the soil it was bred for. He harvested 9,400 pounds over a 3-week picking period. The county extension agent, Tom Farley, had heard about the south field from Clyde Maynard and drove out in the second week of harvest. He stood between the rows and looked at the plant density and the fruit load and asked Vernon what the amendment inputs had been. Vernon showed him the notebook. Farley read the 7-layer formula carefully, then looked up. He said, "Where did this come from?" Vernon said, 1931. Farley asked if he could borrow the notebook. Vernon said no, but offered to have it photographed. Farley drove back to Pikeville and called the University of Kentucky Cooperative Extension Service in Lexington. The soil scientist he reached, a researcher named Dr. Patricia Odom, said she would come to Pike County in October. In September, Vernon entered the mortgage lifters in the All-American Selections Eastern Regional Vegetable Trial, administered through the University of Kentucky, submitting 6 specimens with documentation of growing conditions, soil preparation, and full yield data. He had entered the trial twice before, in 1971 and 1978, without placing. The 1984 submission included the soil core data Farley had helped compile. The judges evaluated consistency, yield efficiency, and growing condition documentation alongside specimen quality. On November 9, 1984, a letter arrived from the All-American Selections Eastern Regional Trial Committee. Vernon read it at the kitchen table at 6 in the morning, in the same chair where he had read Notebook 7 the previous November. His entry had been selected as the Outstanding Vegetable Grower Regional Heritage category for the 1984 Eastern Trials. The award carried a certificate, a plaque, and a cash prize of $800. He put the letter down and poured a second cup of coffee. His wife Nell came into the kitchen and saw his face and said, "Well," he said, "we won something." She sat down and read the letter. She folded it along its original crease and placed it precisely on top of the notebook. She said, "Your daddy knew that formula worked." He said, "Tharp knew it." Word moved through Pike County the way word moved in 1984, at the feed counter at church, in the gravel parking lots of the co-ops on Saturday morning. Roy Bentley heard it from Tom Farley. Clyde Maynard heard it from Roy Bentley. Clyde drove to the south field on a Sunday afternoon in November when the plants had been pulled and the field lay dark and bare under a gray sky. He stood at the fence line for a long time. He said, 9,400 pounds. Vernon said, "Yes." Clyde looked at the field, then at Vernon. He said, "On cold ground." Vernon said, "Under it." The legal resolution arrived in February of 1985. The Kentucky Department for Natural Resources issued a notice of violation to the Randall Extraction Company for fugitive dust emissions exceeding permit boundaries, based on documentation compiled by Dale Munsey. The company received a civil penalty of $22,000 and an order to install water mister suppression systems along the upwind edge of the processing facility within 90 days. The company also entered a private settlement with Vernon Caudill for an amount Munsey described only as sufficient, covering retainer costs, amendment materials, and the calculated lost productivity value of the contaminated acreage across the prior 3 growing seasons. Gary Holt signed the settlement documents. He did not appear in person. Dr. Patricia Odom arrived in Pike County in October of 1984 and spent 2 days taking soil cores from the south field at 20-foot intervals across a diagonal transect. She brought her own equipment, a portable pH meter, a penetrometer for compaction measurement, and graduated sample tubes that extracted the layered profile intact. When she pulled a core from the center of the field, the 7 layers were visible in cross-section. The dark coal fines band at depth, clean against the lighter amendments above and below it, precisely as the notebook formula had specified. She submitted her findings to the Journal of Appalachian Agricultural Research in December of 1984. The paper, published in the spring 1985 issue, documented what she called a pre-existing and previously unpublished stratified carbon amendment technique of apparent Appalachian origin, and described its effects on soil moisture retention, root zone carbon availability, and surface horizon pH stability in measurable, reproducible terms. She credited Cecil Caudill's transcription of the Tharp correspondence and noted that Tharp's original field notebooks, if they existed in the West Virginia Extension Archives, would warrant examination. They did exist. A librarian at West Virginia University located them in January of 1986, cataloged under Inactive Research, Coal Region Soils, 1928-1936, unretrieved since 1941. Dr. Odom incorporated the Tharp-Caudill Amendment Protocol into the University of Kentucky's remediated land cultivation curriculum in 1986. The following spring, 3 farms in Letcher County and 2 in Harlan County attempted variations of the 7-layer system on coal-affected land. All 5 reported measurable yield improvement in the first growing season. None of them had met Vernon Caudill. They had read the 4-page extension pamphlet Dr. Odom's office had printed, which included the full layer sequence, depth ratios, and timing notes copied directly from the Tharp correspondence. Vernon received an invitation by mail to the Cooperative Extension Conference at the University of Kentucky in November of 1985, where Dr. Odom presented the full findings. He wrote back declining it on the same day, in 2 sentences. He was preparing the South Field for the 1985 season. 13 years passed. In October of 1997, Vernon's grandson Alec, 17 that spring, intending to study agriculture at Morehead State, walked the south field with him on a Saturday morning when the air smelled of frost and wood smoke, and the light came flat and white off Elkhorn Ridge. The ground was firm underfoot but not frozen, and the smell of the turned earth between the rows was the particular autumn smell of a field that had been producing for a long time, deep, slightly sweet, nothing sharp in it. Vernon had said nothing in response to Alec's college plans. He had simply started taking the boy to the field on Saturdays. They stopped at the center of the field, and Vernon crouched and pressed 2 fingers into the soil. He looked at what he pulled up. He handed it to the boy. Alec held it and felt the texture, friable, dark, with a slight resistance that told you organic matter was holding the structure together. He said, "It still feels different here than it does on the ridge." Vernon said, "That's the depth." Alec asked why they still spread the straw layer each fall. The coal finds were no longer a surface problem. Randall's suppression system had been running since 1985, and no new contamination had arrived in 12 years. Vernon said the straw wasn't for the coal. The straw was to maintain what the layers below needed from above. You could stop doing it. The profile would hold for several seasons. But Tharp had written that consistency mattered more than necessity, and the man had been correct about everything else. Alec asked who Tharp was. Vernon took him inside and showed him Notebook 7. He showed the boy the 7-layer diagram his father had copied from Tharp's carbon letters, measurements given in inches and fractions of inches, margin notes added in pencil about the bottomland's specific drainage behavior. He showed him how to read the formula and calculate the proportions for a given field dimension. He showed him the maintenance log for the Farmall Super M, hanging from its nail inside the barn door, and explained that the tractor had run for 43 years because someone had written down every service it needed and performed each service on the specified date. Alec said, "Couldn't we get something newer?" Vernon said, "This one works." He said it without emphasis, the way you say something that has stopped being arguable. The Farmall's engine turned over on the first pull of the throttle that morning. Alec stood beside it in the barn doorway and listened to the sound it made, a particular mechanical rhythm, neither rough nor smooth, that came from 43 years of recorded precision and nothing else. Vernon let the engine warm for 4 minutes, checked the hydraulic pressure, and drove it out into the October light. The south field in Pike County, Kentucky grew mortgage lifter tomatoes for 22 consecutive seasons after the winter Vernon built the 7 layers. The coal finds the Randall Extraction Company scattered across it in 1983 remained in the soil at depth. They were not removed. They were placed. The distinction, in soil science terms, is the difference between contamination and structure. Tharp had understood this in 1931. Dr. Odom had documented it in 1985, and 5 farms in 2 counties had confirmed it in a single growing season without ever knowing the man who had proved it first. What the experts had measured was accurate. Coal finds at the surface caused harm. Their error was not in the observation, it was in the depth. They had measured the problem where it lay and concluded it could not be moved. Vernon had read a notebook written by a dead man and understood that the coal had to go somewhere specific before it could become anything useful. 14 inches down, 3rd layer from the bottom. Vernon Caudill sold the last crop from the South Field in the fall of 2001. He was 82 years old. The Federal Land Bank loan had been paid in full in 1991. The farm passed to his son, and then to Alec in the way that farms pass. The Farmall Super M is still in the barn. The maintenance log is still on its nail. The oil is still changed on the interval Cecil Caudill first specified in 1954, the year the tractor was new, the year he wrote down what it needed and set the expectation that someone would keep meeting it. The South Field still grows mortgage lifters in the rotation. The coal fines are still at 14 inches, exactly where Vernon put them. What the company left on his land, he buried at the depth where it could do what it was built to do. The knowledge that made this possible was 50 years old before the problem arrived. It had been waiting in a notebook on a shelf, in the handwriting of a man who was gone, for the exact moment when it was needed. It waited. Then it was used.